Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. David and I were just speaking, and it's 1 p.m. here in Chicago and 11 a.m. there on the West Coast. But I want to welcome everyone to our webinar on change management, the project you plan for and the project you manage after design. Our presenter is David Ericksen, the David Ericksen, literally the best in the business here. He's defense attorney at Ericksen Legal, one of the best, if not the best. And he also, friend of the program, helps us with our risk management and defends a lot of our insureds as well. And David and I go way back. And so we're excited for this program here.
Good morning, Sandip. It's welcome everyone. And Sandip, thank you for including me here.
Yeah, of course. So with that, we're going to get started. So I'm Sandip Chandarana, the director of PUA. We are the managing general agent for Arch Insurance Company. We were formed in 1990, and we really want to thank our carrier partner, Arch Insurance Company, who is putting this webinar on for our insureds and our key agents and many of their clients who are not Arch insured. So I'm not going to get into the details of PUA other than we've been doing this a long time. We've got, Arch is our carrier. They insure many of you, and one of the really well-rounded program in terms of broad policy form, great risk management services, outstanding claims. And we're here to assist you in navigating through difficult, complex risks and issues. Before we get started, a couple house cleaning items here. So for all the licensed architects and engineers out there, we will give you instructions at the end, and we will send you a certificate of attendance so that you could self-report this to whether it's the AIA or you can report this to your state regulatory to get a CE credit. Secondly, if you have any questions, please use the chat box, and we will periodically stop throughout the presentation here, and I will pose those questions to David. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to David, and off we go.
Well, thank you, Sandip, and good day, everybody. We're really excited to share this time with you in terms of what's going on here. This whole program is really about my bringing to reality, hopefully in the design and construction world, one of my favorite movies. One of my favorite movies is The Natural. And in that movie, Glenn Close says to Robert Redford, Roy, he was his name, Roy, I believe we have two lives, the one we learn with and the one we live with after that. And the parallel here is that we really have two projects. There's the one that you plan for or should plan for, and then there's the reality of the project that you live with after that. And so often, as I've gone through my now 3-decade career dealing with design professionals, representing them and managing that, when we're in the white ivory tower of our design and putting it together, we're great. But then the challenges in the field, when others get involved and other things come up, becomes the real challenge, and that's where we lead to a lot of the claims. And so it's kind of an illustration because we want to build this around telling you real world stories. I want to start with both a positive and a negative. Then we're going to start with the positive. That's a unique thing in one of these programs, I know, to start out with the story of success, but this is really one of them. And this project, as you see depicted on the side here, is a project in Marin County, north of the Golden Gate Bridge here from San Francisco, where I'm sitting right now. In the center up there is a huge research facility that was being planned and installed. And my client was the civil engineer, or the geotechnical engineer rather, for that project, as well as a project associated with it. And as a part of doing that, they provided a geotechnical design. As you can imagine, a hillside property adjacent to San Francisco Bay may or may not have a couple geotechnical issues around it. And as they went forward with it, they designed it and they went forward well, and they got through their design part of it. And then the client got cheap. The client knew that somebody else could do the construction phases cheaper and for less money than my client did it. As it turned out, during the construction phase, this owner, as a part of a compromise with an adjacent homeowner development, decided, in the brilliance of managing these situations, to put in a 100-foot long, 50-foot high earthen berm adjacent to this building and uphill from a residential development in order to hide the visual effects of this building. Well, it's not going to be a big surprise to you when I say that what happened then was all of that loading at the top of the hill forced the residential development below to move, and all of the houses started to move and all over the place. Their foundations were cracked and broken, and there was a massive piece of litigation. Everybody got sued, including my geotechnical engineer, who had done the initial geotechnical engineering report for the project and signed off on it. But remember, he didn't complete his services, and he did one of the best exit letters I have ever seen, which said that we are leaving the project and pursuant to a particular code in the Business Professions Code of California, we are not responsible for any changes that take place after this point in time. That became the centerpiece of where we defended this, and as opposed to the other parties that funded something in excess of $40 million to settle this case, we were able to largely walk away from this because he had documented and managed that change moment well. And so when we manage and are aware of these things and respond appropriately, we can do some really positive things. By the way, there's also a contract clause related to this that we're going to get to in a couple moments. Unfortunately, you all know that that's not always the case, that we're not always going to manage these change situations successfully. And so in our next slide, we've really got one that talks about a different scenario for what's out there. And if we can get that, there we go. And here on the right-hand side, I have one of the oxymorons of our institutions or our projects, which is value engineering. The concept that we are adding value by reducing costs in engineering really just strikes me as crazy. But that being said, this is a project, and this is one of the projects that's become very common in California. This was a water storage system. This was a K-12 school. It was actually a middle school that was being installed with associated athletic fields. And this field of these pipes was to store rainwater during the rainy season to irrigate all of these beautiful athletic fields and the landscaping of the school during the drier months of the year, which we have a lot of here in California. In the original design, as put forward by my engineer, they called for these drainage facilities to be large concrete tanks or pipes. So they're going to be storing them in concrete pipes. Contractor comes along, and the contractor goes to the district and says, hey, we can save you $250,000. $250,000 if we change this from these concrete pipes, which are going to be very hard for us to install, to these plastic pipes, these plastic drainage pipes, which are just as good and will manage it. The client requested that my client review the substitution. They looked at it. They kind of said, okay, and they did not take exception to it. As it turns out, unfortunately, as opposed to concrete pipes, which are basically watertight, the ASTM standard for this type of drainage pipe is that it can lose up to 1% of its volume per day. That's allowable under the standards and the acceptable materials. That's all well and good when these pipes are being used for their standard use, which is a drainage pipe. But when you're intending to store water in them for 2, 3, 5, 7 months, that doesn't work as well. And so in this situation, by approving and going along with the change order, my client unfortunately stepped into a situation where they then were partially responsible and largely funded about a $1.7 million system. Not the project they planned, not the project they designed, but the project they lived with after that. And so as we look forward in the next slide to our real world realities, what we're talking about here is, what really goes on out there. And let's just acknowledge it. Very few projects unfold as planned. Very few unfold as planned, if there even was a plan. And I'm just going to be straight up, way too often the plan never really takes off and we don't have one. The successful firms, the successful design professionals are going to identify, manage, and lead the change. And the successful will sometimes even do the audacious and reject a contractor or client change because it's not the right thing to do, or will at least take it to the next level in the steps. Unfortunately, the victims, those that I've seen way too many times, those like in our drainage pipe situation with the water storage system, receive the changes, receive the issues, and essentially retreat, capitulate, and then are left to nothing more than a reaction model for what's taking place here in terms of what takes place. Even where I want to address this one in terms of what we can do in terms of the rejection and the leading the change. I had another situation up at an airport in Northern California. In that particular situation, much like the situation that we had at that school district, the contractor proposed a new type of drainage pipe for the sanitary sewer and the storm drain system they were installing. A new type of pipe that was going to be easier and faster for them to install because of new connection techniques. It had no track record, it had no history, but the client and the contractor wanted to use it because it was going to save money and go longer. This was used throughout California. There were multiple lawsuits because the reality is the system didn't work. My engineer, though, had written a great evaluation memo saying, here's the options, the traditional, the new, weighing it, and then letting the client make the decision about it, essentially leading and documenting that process to a positive outcome. So with those three kind of examples as our background, let's get into the agenda that we have for you in our next slide. Where we want to go with this today is, we want to really emphasize project planning as a change management platform. You can't manage change if you don't have a plan, because if you don't have a plan, do you really have a change? Because you didn't know where you were going. Because I'm a lawyer, because I care about it, and because it's been so important in the DNA of the PUA and ARCH programs, we want to talk about the contract, because I truly believe that is the foundation for what we're talking about in terms of containing the change by contract. And we're going to give you some examples for that I think can be game changers in this if you recognize them and honor them as you go forward. We want to talk about how to identify changes of significance. Like we say, every project changes. Clients change their minds, site conditions change, contractors change, all of that. How do we define, or I look into what is important or not, and then we want to go through the tools and procedures, how to analyze that and take the corresponding action for success. And then finally, because really we want to illustrate this for you, we're going to take you through three examples of that in real projects that I handled in litigation that we went through, where there were project changes in clients, contracts, and programming. Each of them, unfortunately, ended up in a fairly negative situation because the change was not correctly handled. And so what we want to try to do is learn from those experiences as we go forward and manage that into the future. As we say in the next slide, and as we quote the great leader, Winston Churchill, the planning imperative, he who fails to plan is planning to fail. I'm not sure that's completely true, because I don't think we're expecting to fail, but the reality is that if we don't have a plan, I believe that the likelihood of failure grows exponentially. So as we look at the next slide, we're going to talk about project planning in the real world. And I've lived with all of you for many years. As Sandip's reference, I've been representing design professionals now since about 1993, 1994. It's been the devotion of my practice, both in litigation and defending claims, as well as the general counsel and risk management and transactional side, trying to keep people out of it. And what I've learned from those two sides of my experience is that internally to firms, too often project planning is not considered a valuable task. Too often we try to get the project in, and once we get it in, we're off and running, and we don't think it through in terms of what we do. When we do actually plan, too many of the plans, and I love the optimism that this reveals, but it's also not particularly good from risk management, is we plan for the best, and then the unforeseen things happen. We need to look beyond that. The more narrow a system is, the easier it is to disrupt, and we need to have plans that consider both the risks coming up as well as building in the procedures to manage those as we get into them. So without a plan, as we see in the next slide, there really is, nothing really going on. And so what we need to do is, how do you build for this? And I want to suggest to you that there are three levels that you should go through in project preparation and planning so that you're ready. Ideally, you're dealing with projects that are within your core sweet spot, your experience. We're not too far out of our experience area, so we can have a baseline project plan for our core projects. The core type of thing that you do. If you're an infrastructure engineer, the core projects that you're doing there. If you're residential, how do we typically approach these projects? what is our standard. But then we recognize no two projects, no two sites, no two clients, no two sets of project teams are likely to be identical. And so there we are going to have the variations. That's where we need to take the step back from our core plan and say, what is different here? And how are we managing, addressing, or identifying that in terms of what's going on? And then finally, once we've done that, to get to the contingency or risk planning. How are we going to identify contingencies? How are we going to manage them? What is our process in place for doing all of that? And I will submit to you that if you can take these 3 steps in advance of a project, my experience is that your claims will go down dramatically. I had a large architectural firm here in San Francisco once upon a time. They were a great firm, but with great projects. They had FAIA all over what they were doing. They got AIA awards all the time, but they also were good for 5 to 6 claims coming my direction a year that we would have to defend. As we looked at it, we then took a step back and we looked at it. And in that, what we recognized is that there was a missing element in their project planning and their risk identification, particularly with respect to the project team. We made one little change in terms of how we manage the subconsultants and the project plan for that. And they went from 5 to 6 claims a year to 0 claims a year for 8 years. I had to find another way to pay for the 4 kids to go to college in terms of what was taking place there. And so that's really the core issues for what we're looking at. Building a plan, as we say in the next slide, is really the ultimate element. And this is my checklist. And so when I'm sitting down with one of my clients and we're looking at a project, we're developing either a core plan for the core projects, or we're looking at a particular project and how we do it, this is what we look at. And if there's a new project, we develop a checklist that goes with this. These are the core issues that have driven so many of the claims, so many of the issues and the upsets. And so we really look at these. Client selection, project selection with a scope for success, a detailed scope, an appropriate scope, and a closed-ended scope. Team selection, the design team, who are we working with on the design team, the owner team, and the owner team is the contractors, the owner itself, and the other consultants they need to retain, because one weak link in all of that can be our big breaker. Looking at the risk assessment versus the economic benefits, I love you all as design professionals, but you just don't do that well enough traditionally. The classic example over the years has always been the condominium project, where you make one model design and it gets replicated 100 times. But there are other examples of it, and we need to look at that so that we make sure that we are either being compensated fairly or our risk is being controlled and contained, consistent with the risk that we're taking, and then a contract framed plan for informed project delivery. What I mean by that, there's a lot of words buried in that. But what it means is we are framing this plan in a contract. A contract, by definition, is supposed to meet a meeting of the minds between you and your client, that you're on the same page, that you've educated them, and you're doing that together. And as you do that, that informs the client as to what is taking place and going on. About 15 years ago in 2010, the AIA Trust commissioned me to do a new white paper for them on the sustainable standard of care, trying to deal with environmental concerns, new technology, and those types of things taking place in the design environment and what that was doing to the standard of care. I wrote a great paper addressing sustainable design, new technology design, new products, things like that. And then the AIA Trust came back and they said, David, we want a new first chapter. We want you to write a first chapter for us talking about informed consent and the client's role in it. And we wrote that, and I'm going to just say to you that it is absolutely true. It is the client's project. The client drives it. They're making the decisions. And if we can get them informed and have them sign off, it's one of the most valuable things that we can do to protect ourselves, both in terms of our compensation as well as the claims coming down the road at us. And the AIA, in fact, in the B101, if you've ever seen it, gives an incredibly valuable tool for that as a management guide to what's all going on. So As we build these plans out and the contract guides for what we're going on, the preliminary project plan is the guide to contract drafting. It should reflect and conform to contract realities. That is what's going to be out there, what's going to be in our contract, and it should be a living, breathing document that we go on through the entire course of the project and as we manage it going forward. Ultimately reflecting, for me, because I'm an attorney, into the contract. So the next slide starts to walk us through the contract elements of all of this as we're looking at this. And the guiding principle, as I said, is a contract is to represent a meeting of the minds. That's where we inform the client, we educate the client, and they agree to it. To be binding, it's supposed to be an offer, an acceptance, and consideration. That's what they taught me years and years ago in law school. I know Sandep learned the same thing way back when. But as we get into the contracts, particularly in this moment, we want to talk about how to contain the change. And these are my three big buckets for what we want to contain in the change. We're going to give you the tools to build some of this in. But we want to contain the relationship. If you remember, the first planning and strategic evaluation idea we had was select your clients. You should be picking your clients just as much as they are picking you, so that it's a partnership, it's a relationship, there's parity there. And if that's the case, we want to have a bound and committed relationship. It's almost like a prenuptial agreement. In that regard, don't allow your services to be assigned, transferred, or handed off. This is about your relationship, and you're having that committed relationship, and it's between you and your client, not third parties, not others. And so you would disclaim, as we'll see, beneficiaries and other parts. Then what's your role? What is your role in terms of being defined, complete, in the scope of work? The scope of work is the single most important clause that you have in your agreement, provided that it is closed-ended, detailed, and limited, and it can include appropriate assumptions and avoid reductions. And then how are you going to manage substitutions and changes? So let us give you now, for a couple minutes, kind of a toolbox of these clauses and how to manage those kind of going forward. You'll get a copy of this PowerPoint later. You don't have to be taking pictures or screenshots. You can if you want. But we're going to walk through some of the agreement that we talked about. This is the one about the relationship and the committed relationship. And what it says here in the first part is, this agreement is for the sole benefit of you and your client. We're not trying to benefit neighbors, investors, outside parties, lenders, contractors, anybody else. This is solely for us and intended solely for this particular project. And as a result, we have this second clause that says neither party can assign or transfer this agreement or our work product without the written consent of both parties. This is the committed and limited relationship clauses, and so important to managing change, because as we're going to see in one of our examples, in fact the first example we'll get to in the case studies later, that transition and that handing off was probably the seeds of what became a major claim and a major loss per that particular firm. Once we get beyond that, the next slide talks about what we're really doing in our scope of work in terms of what we're handling and what we're doing. And this goes back to that example I gave earlier, that very first positive example, because what we see so often is clients will get cheap, clients will change, clients will want to do that, all of which works to your detriment. And in this clause, which was actually drawn from a California ACEC standard form agreement, what it says is, we're signing up for this project and this scope of work based on the expectation that we're going to do everything we have in our plan and our scope of work. That is our plan. That's our risk management approach. And if you, the client, decide to reduce our scope of services, you are going to, you'll see there in the fifth line down, release, hold harmless, and indemnify us from everything that is coming up out of that. That clause that I've now built into all of my agreements, that geotechnical engineer had in his agreement, can be the greatest protection if something happens in a reduced scope of work. And if you want to stay on the project, it's actually one of the greatest tools to staying on the project. I can't tell you how many times I've had this clause in my agreements. The client wanted to change horses until they read this and they said, oh, never mind, we'll stick with you and we'll keep paying your fees for what's taking place here. So and then the next clause that we have in terms of talking about it is what goes into that scope of work. Because so many of you, I'm sure, will end up with a client agreement that has some of the non-standard types of clauses there, or what they will not negotiate on. Your scope of work, however, they will frequently agree to. And what it says is that our services are limited to that scope of work and we have no other obligations beyond that. And so what we're trying to do there is make sure that this is complete and we're not taking on anything else. Nevertheless, unfortunately, I know that you have service-oriented people in your offices, people that will go above and beyond if the client asks. And because you've gone to the steps of having a good agreement, we want to make sure everything's there. And we say, nevertheless, all of our communications, actions, and documentation relative to the project are covered by this agreement. So that if somebody goes outside our scope, we have a little scope creep or they don't get something properly documented, we are still going to be protected here by the other protective clauses that we've talked about in terms of what is taking place, in terms of the management of what's taking place. Then in that scope of work, the next slide really talks about the assumptions. And where your client is not agreeing to something, where they want to put something in the agreement or it's their form of the agreement, building in these assumptions of what your expectations is builds that informed consent that we talked about earlier. So that if you list things here, the client then signs the agreement, we have that built in and we can go back and say, no, remember, we're doing our services based on these assumptions of what you're going to do, what others are going to do, what the funding expectations are, what the building review expectations are, and accordingly, if it changes, we are not going to be accountable for it, or we're going to have a modification in our fee and schedule. So those assumptions are very important. Now I'm going to steal in this next slide about approvals from something that I referenced a little while ago from the AIA B101, but this is one of their very valuable clauses that I believe they have there, which says the client's going to review and approve our services at the milestones identified below, and in the event of any subsequent change or modification, the consultant scope, schedule, and compensation will be adjusted accordingly. Remember that firm I talked about earlier on in the program that had 5 or 6 claims a year? This was the change. This was the change where by getting the incremental sign-offs, rather than simply receiving and reacting to changes and just basically accepting them, this changed everything for them, because everything after that became something the client had to pay for. Everything after that became something which we could not be responsible for because the client had signed off on it in terms of what's taking place. And then finally, we talked about the substitutions. And so the next slide about the substitutions really goes to the whole issue of preserving the project. And what we want to do here is, we talked about early on about that contractor substitution, having a clause that says, we're reviewing this only for general conformance, and saying there at the end, the last 3 lines, the contractor shall remain exclusively responsible for the satisfaction of all project objectives, codes, and criteria. Had I had that particular clause in that water tank storage system, we have no liability, no issues, and nothing would have taken place negatively in that particular situation as we had gone through it and into what matters for that particular project. So those are the clauses that we have. I think those are the important ones that can have some of the really big impacts here for what's taking place. But let's play that out now a little bit in the world that's out there in terms of, what happens. The changes that I have seen so often will come up are unforeseen site conditions, contractor performance issues, weather, and code and regulations. These are kind of the standard ones that you see, and I think you're probably pretty good at handling those. The harder ones are the really critical categories, the ones in the next slide about different things that we can see as we go through all of this. And when these change, these critical ones, can we go to the next slide, please? Great. These types of things change, we need to take account of it. These are the types of changes that could be the red flag trigger moments. We should have this in our checklist at the outset of the project. Our project manager should constantly be kind of trained or educated on what these are and what to do about them. And that's where the client change, contract change, our scope or program changes up or down, change in who the lead level players are, or changes in the economics. Either we're not getting paid, there's change orders, costs are going up, all of those sorts of things, and we need to really be able to look at that. As we look at that, the next slide really takes you through 2 types of ways to monitor this. And if you look at this, we've kind of got 2. You'll see at the top 4 bullet points are metric based. looking at these types of things and having thresholds for our response in terms of earned value. We're off schedule, we're behind on payments. And then we have the event-based types of things where we have scope changes, staff or representation changes, or we have problematic communications that are taking place in the course of the project that's out there. And so what we want to do is we want to have our ties to managing that in the next slide. As we go through these two things, the metric models, this is just kind of a deeper dive in terms of what I would have out there when I'm working with firms on how to manage either planning projects or projects in trouble. This is our checklist that I would go through, and I'd sit down and say, how are we doing on this? And to have this be a periodic check-in. When I'm advising firms how to monitor and look for issues at the key project milestones, either based on a quantum of time or based on a project milestone, I would ask the project management and leadership to sit down with the leadership of the firm and to go through and confirm this quarterly project milestones. And if you're running a division or a department within a firm, these are the things that you would look for. This is the metric model. The next slide kind of has the event model that takes place. And as opposed to the metric model, which takes place at milestones, this is the event model where we would kind of be instructing our project management team, hey, these are our big six. If you've got something that's triggered here that's coming up under one of these, raise your hand, let's have a discussion, and let's figure it out in terms of what's taking place, in terms of the model for what's out there. When that happens, I want to give you kind of a risk management model for how to deal with it in the project plan, which is the next thing that's out there in our slides. And in that, we can skip forward to the next slide, which is out there. So something happens. You get a trigger moment in that metric in terms of the metric model or the risk model. And in that moment, you're seeing something is happening. I'm going to get to IROPE in a second, which is my acronym for dealing with it. But you also, at that point in time, should engage internal and external sources so that you're not going solo. So you're not just sticking your head in the sand, and then to figure out what's going on, document the event and the action, and then follow up and stay consistent with it. In this moment, Sandip, I'm going to take just a moment here and bring you into this. If you could just talk for a moment, particularly within the ARCH program, but overall, the pre-claim assistance type of thing and the value of that, because so often these types of moments are there, and the value of contacting brokers and PUA and ARCH to get them involved early in trying to assess these situations.
Yeah, absolutely, David. So we are big proponents of pre-claims assistance. It's included in the policy form. It's no cost to our insureds, and we like to get out in front of these claims, assist you, and really try to nip the claims in the bud. So if, we have Kent Holland of Construction Risk LLC handles our pre-claims assistance and our risk management services as part of the ARCH program. And he gets involved, and he'll be involved along with the ARCH claims department. And sometimes we'll even assign defense counsel at our cost to assist you through these. And we will walk you through this and guide you right up until that point. And our hope is we can use the pre-claims assistance to avoid a claim. But if it does get to the point where this is now going to trigger a claim under the policy, we will guide you through that as well. And at that point, we'll say, okay, now this is a claim, and we need to a claim is triggered under the policy, and we need to move in that direction. But definitely, the earlier the better. And I think what David's talking about here is very pertinent. A lot of these issues and material markers and whatnot, we can assist you in navigating all of those.
And I will say that PUA and ARCH have one of the best early claim assistance support programs out there. Kent Holland and Construction Risk, I know them well. I've known them for decades. They're tremendous. You can also engage your local counsel, your local broker, whatever it makes sense. But it's a tremendous asset that you have here, and I'll say one of the best in the industry. Not every carrier, not every program has this robust and qualified an approach to dealing with it. If you happen to not be a part of the ARCH and PUA world ever for anything like this, getting involved with your attorney, though, also has that advantage. Kent Holland, the PUA team, talking to them creates this attorney-client privilege. You get that safe space for talking this through, which is also really important so that you can have a candid conversation about it and really move forward with all of that. The key to that is act early, figure it out early, and then continue to follow it up. Seldom are these set it and forget it issues. These are issues that require follow-up, persistence, and going forward, and you need to stay on it. I've suggested here 10, 30, and 90 days checkbacks and adjusting as normal. A lot of the time I can have an issue behind us in that 30 to 90 day time period. The 10-day time period, we're typically in the middle of it, and we're assessing what the initial response has been and where to go from there. And so I really think that's an important thing to do in all of that. Up at the top of this, I've got IROPE, and I really believe in acronyms. They help me learn, they help me teach, and they give me a protocol. Back when I was in law school at the University of California, the first thing I learned in law school, Sandip, you might have been similar, was an acronym IRAC, I-R-A-C. Issue, Rule, Analysis, Conclusion, and it has guided my legal career almost ever since. I have 3 lawyers in the next generation of my family. All of them learned some version of that recently in law school, so it stuck with us. In this context, I have IROPE as issue, risk, options, plan, and execute. And that's what we should be doing in these situations. If you have interest in this topic and want to know more, particularly about my approach to IROPE, reach out to your PUA team. There's a white paper that I wrote that goes through this in some pretty good detail about all of that. Would be happy to make that available to all of you through PUA and as a resource for you to look at. But that is really the step.
Yeah,
because
real quick, David, to PUA University on our website, so www.puainc.com. Your white papers and all our past webinars are there.
Well, we'll get that one posted up, or make sure that we've got that one there, Sandip. Okay. And if you can't find it, please reach out to me. Please reach out to Sandip or whoever you know at PUA or Arch, and we'll get it to you so that you've got it. Just offering that up because it does go through and then builds that example through a couple case studies, which we're going to do here in this moment. And so what we want to transition now to is really taking you through 3 examples. This is kind of like the NASCAR experience. People go to NASCAR and it's really interesting to watch the cars go round and round. All people remember those, the crashes, right? And so we're talking about, unfortunately, 3 crashes for our clients and some projects here that took place, and we want to illustrate how this takes place in this situation. And so this one is about client change. Remember, client selection was the very first thing that we talked about. I talked about the value of a committed relationship and having that there. We talked about the no assignment and the no third-party beneficiary clause. Well, in this situation, unfortunately, my client, an architect who'd been through 7 different successful projects with this particular client on large military base installations, didn't have that. Their client then got sold out to one of the big multinational ENR top 10 type contracting firms. And as a result, on this design build project, there was a very different approach, a very different model, and it didn't work well. So let's walk through that and some of the lessons that we have in that in terms of the next slide, please. So my setting for this one is, this was a design build renovation project for one of the largest military installations in the United States here on the West Coast. For this, they were trying to renovate, for the benefit of the military personnel, 700 individual units of residential housing. Those units had been built at some point in time between the end of World War II and the end of the Vietnam War. So that's about a 20-25 year spectrum. And multiple project delivery models. As you can imagine, public records, military records over that long a period of time and different approaches were not particularly well done for that particular part in having a record. But my client thought they could do it. They had done 7 of these before very successfully with this client, where they had done a design build approach and they had done it. Their design build client thought they knew how to do it. They'd worked on it successfully. And what they did here, as they'd done in the past, is that the client got into, the design builder got into a fixed price, $50 million contract with the military based on 15% design documents. We've talked a lot about design build in the past. I know you've heard a lot about design build in the past, but at that same time, the design builder went to a fixed price contract with his contractor's subsidiary, so they were fixed price on that. They built in 0 design contingency, 0 design contingency. As they then went forward into the project, as we see in the next slide, the original agreement for the project, so this is an overview of the project. We can probably skip past this one, and we can skip past the next one too as a matter of timing here. This kind of illustrates the number and types of units we have. This is the slide I want to focus on. Because based on their project experience, the client had a number of different approaches for the particular project, for these design build projects, where it was so varied over time. And what they had there was particularly assigned to the owner, that is the design builder. You see number 5 down there, existing facilities surveys. Fundamental here, 700 units built over 2.5 decades, different styles, different approaches, different subcontractors, all of that. As it turned out in this particular situation, when they sold out to the large multinational, the multinational didn't want to do it. Unfortunately, the architect from my architectural firm wasn't really focused in on this, and instead of doing what he should have done is look at the contract, look at it and say, no, we need to get this from you. He spent a week and a half at the military base trying to go through the existing documents and taking responsibility for this particular issue. Side teaching point here, he never had the agreement. And because of that, he didn't know what his obligations were, and they were not. And as a result, he went outside the scope. We call that a scope bust, extra contractual services, which took us out of all of the great protections, including those about the standard of care and limited duties and indemnity that we had in our agreement that was out there in terms of taking place for that particular project. So unfortunately, as that all played out, we had these particular clauses that came up, and these were the clauses in the agreement. They were working from a standard AIA agreement, but what it said was, the architect shall be entitled to rely on the accuracy and completeness of the services furnished by the owner. I loved that clause. I loved that clause. Except my architect hadn't relied on the owner, the design builder, for this. They had taken that responsibility onto themselves. Next clause that we have here. In this further clause, we had a different clause which was arguably in conflict with this, and this is where we got caught up in this. It said, without limiting the foregoing, the architect shall have sole and exclusive responsibility for the design and engineering of the project, and the architect shall prepare and provide various drawings, specifications, and other design documents necessary or appropriate for completion of the project. All in, all done. We were in arbitration. We had a somewhat standard, generic standard of care clause in this agreement, and what the arbitrator said was that that based on this clause as well as the extra contractual services, we had committed to an extra contractual scope and guarantee above and beyond the standard of care. That's why forever and always now I will put into my clauses that we're going to perform, our services will be performed consistent with and limited to the applicable standard of care. That was my huge lessons learned out of this particular moment in terms of what took place. Ultimately, what happened, as we describe in the claim here, the design builders, I said, sold out to a large company 6 weeks before the CDs were complete. I mean, we're deep into it at this point. The architect de facto did all of the existing site plans, and they received undifferentiated directions simultaneously from the new design builder and the contractor subsidiary. The end result was that the claim was made for they went over the $50 million fixed price bid by $1.1 million. They sought to recover all of that from the architect, even though they had done it based on 15% design documents, differing conditions, and they rejected any value engineering solutions that we had offered during the course and scope of the project. And so what are the net results here? What do we want to do as strategies? What have I learned from this one is we need to contract consistent with your project delivery strategies and principles, not just faith and trust. Too often we go in thinking we can do it on a handshake, understanding that we cannot let our services just be unilaterally assigned. If there's a new client, a new person, we should have this opportunity to sign on and change things, and then establish our organizational structures internally for what's taking place here. The other element is, as I said, this is a design build project, something a little bit different from the standard out there. So Sandy, I know for years and years, so many on the line here have done design, bid, build. particularly with respect to design build projects. This design builder claimed to have no professional responsibilities, claimed to have no contingencies. What, in terms of insurance considerations, might be a little bit different for a design professional on a design build project?
Yeah, I think for a designer on a design build project, they want to look upstream. And I think one thing they could have done here to protect themselves was to make sure that the design build contractor had their own professional liability policy. It seems like this situation, it was almost, they went over their 50 million and they were looking for someone to write a check, and they looked down and downstream to the designer, and that was the checkbook right there. And in reality, if they had their own policy, I think they shared some blame in this, and their policy would have responded to this. So just look upstream if you're a designer.
Yes, I mean, I think two things in that, which is to look upstream to them, making sure they have the appropriate insurance in place. The other thing that I think is important in a design build context, as well as the next one that we're going to go to an example, if we can go forward to the slide that says the contract, is something called additional insured coverage. And in design build context, I like to get that upstream from the design builder to get additional insured coverage for my design professionals. But in any project, it's something that I look at seriously. So before I get into the details of the next example, Sandip, can you just kind of give an overview so people understand what additional insured coverage is, and then what it likely is not in a professional liability context?
Yeah, so an additional insured is somebody that is not the named insured on the policy, but they will be covered in the event of a claim arising from the named insured's activities. And from a professional liability standpoint, we don't ever like to give this. So a professional liability policy covers an insured for their negligence in rendering or failing to render professional services to third-party clients. So if we are going to add an additional insured to a professional liability policy, they're not performing any services, so we don't see that. There's also an insured versus insured exclusion in the policy. So theoretically, if you add a third-party client as an additional insured to a professional policy, you're gonna go up against that exclusion as well. This is really, from my perspective as a PL underwriter, this is more of a GL type scenario where you want to be added as an additional insured upstream or on a general liability policy. You often see it in various contractual relationships, but doesn't really apply, not something we want to do on a professional liability policy, on our design professionals policies.
And I think most of our industry understands that pretty well. I review literally hundreds of contracts for design professionals a year. It's very seldom that I will see anybody try to have additional insured status under the professional side. They will do it on the general liability. And I'm fine with that because I think it's a reasonable thing to do. It's automatic. But I also try to turn that around. And where I'm working for a design builder, or we have a owner that's hiring a separate contractor, I try to get onto their general liability policies as an additional insured. And this next example we have about the contract is absolutely a perfect example of all of that, because here we had the good contract and then it changed just as we had. And so here again, we had a engineer who had been a consultant to the contractor who had done a number of projects through California and infrastructure projects. The 6-year relationship. They had a great working relationship. They'd done multiple projects together. And the one that we were undertaking right now was going to be a steel frame structure demolition, where it was a 150-foot tall steel frame structure in an urban setting. And what they were doing in this situation was to demolish it. My engineer, they didn't want to take it down piece by piece. So my engineer was to design the demolition, design how they were going to topple it. And they had an unfortunately ambiguous on-site presence clause that said they were going to be there on a as requested basis. not the best things in the world, but here's what we had. This is the example of the project. And what they were going to do is for this large steel frame structure, this is 150 feet tall of large I-beam construction. They had called for the cutting of 3 legs. They were going to fail those 3 legs down. You will see closest to you at the bottom of the screen. And then based on that, they were going to pull it over or topple it on that basis. It was a sound plan. They'd done it before. It would work. Unfortunately, I know you've never heard of a situation like this. The contractor had different ideas in terms of what it was going to do. And so in the event that took place here, the contractor, unbeknownst to my engineer, instead of cutting out 3 of the legs, they cut out 5 of the legs and cut all of the cross bracing down at the bottom level. So basically this entire structure was being held in place by a single support structure. My client got out there on a Monday morning. They were going to topple it. It ended up being a total project collapse. Unfortunately, it fell on one worker, it fell on another worker, and another worker was struck. As a result, we had claims by 23 different family members and plaintiffs amounting to over $10 million. My poor client had been out there the morning of the particular event, and as he was looking at it, if we could go forward a couple slides, this will just make this a little bit clearer at this point in time to where we have the picture. Keep going. One more, I think. 2 more. There we go. Oh, not there. Anyway, so this is what happened on the project. We were notified that they were going to topple it. There's my picture. So this is the type of structure that we had going on. And when my engineer got out there the morning of the event, he saw that people were up here in the midst of the structure, playing around, doing all this. He took this picture and he turned around to find the foreman to tell them to get people out of there. The foreman blew him off and said, quote unquote, "You worry too much." 35 seconds later, the entire structure fell over to those events. Horrible situation. The engineer I knew, he called me, he was in tears. We went through that whole thing. Fortunately, I then started to look at the agreement. And so if we can go back to the slide just after punchline. Perfect, right there. We had these clauses. These were the clauses that they'd been using for years and years in their work with this party. Standard of care. Good standard of care clause. More importantly, a limitation of liability. Sandip and I love limitations of liability and having those there. And then we had a job site safety clause that followed this on the next slide that said the contractor was solely responsible for job site safety and they were going to indemnify and hold us harmless for everything on the project. That's how we set up this project. That's how it was working and going forward. Unfortunately, about 2 months before this project happened, remember we'd been working under an existing contract for the prior 6 years and we kept working under that, which is this agreement. Unfortunately, about 2 months before this project, the contractor got a new CFO in. That CFO brought in a new purchase order form for its agreement, and it looked something like this in the next slide. Lots of real fine, tiny print in all of that. And unfortunately, in order to get paid a $3,000 invoice for its demolition design here, my client's internal office administrator signed this invoice. That invoice said as follows, if we can look at the next slide. All of a sudden, it said that the subcontractor, that is my client, would hold harmless, indemnify, and defend the contractor for everything under the sun arising out of or in any way connected with the performance of the work. Not tied to negligence, not tied to anything else. When this claim originally came in, all I had was the original agreement with those great clauses about indemnity, limitation of liability, job site safety, additional insured protections. I tendered the claim to the contractor. Their contractor agreed to it. They said, yep, we get it. We have to cover the whole thing. Their insurance carrier said they were going to cover everything. 2 months later, they discovered this purchase order that we had signed. And all of a sudden, we went from a complete no responsibility, no financial accountability to having a situation where we ended up feeling lucky to settle out of this for $2 million. $2 million because we signed a purchase order, changing our contractual terms for $3,000 of services to be taken. So if we can go forward to our lessons slide that we have a little bit down the road here, the contract lessons and strategy slide. These are the rules. SANDIP, PUA, ARCH, and I believe in these very clearly. Signed agreements for all projects. You should have a signed agreement for all project that recognizes your plan, the danger, and hopefully those things that we talked about at the ability of it. Recognize that we want to have a single contract per project. Unless we go with a master service agreement, I've become kind of a big believer in master service agreements as long as we hold to it, and them in having procedures and authority for contract execution. If you're in a multi-person firm, having those people responsible to and allowed to sign it. As I said, the office administrator here signed this particular purchase order because they wanted to get the $3,000 to make payroll at the end of the month. Treat every contract change as if it is a new contract with that level of scrutiny. Again, I know PUA and ARCH have some of the best contract review and approval services out there. If it's anything that falls into the major core categories that I have in one of my paper called the Pareto 6, scope, standard of care, warranty or guarantee, indemnity, dispute resolution, or third-party rights, contact your PUA and ARCH representative and get a review of it. Get their input into what's taking place in all of that, and then be very, very careful about job site safety issues. And if we can just kind of go to the slide I have, responding to observed conditions. This is, again, planning for the contingencies. When we're planning, we know things are going to go wrong. Project safety and contractors not doing the right thing is always going to be one of those. And so when that happens, just as my person tried to do to notify the responsible person, they went to the superintendent. Don't recommend a solution. You recommend a solution that doesn't work, then you become responsible for it. You recommend a solution, it implies you should have recommended it at the beginning. Clarify it's outside your scope of work, and as soon as you can, confirm it in writing. An exemplar of that is on the next slide in terms of what's there. Using something like this and having it in your contingency risk management change toolbox would be very good to have. We identify the issue. It may be a safety concern, you see, and we're referring it to, we're saying it's outside of our scope of work and did not suggest a solution to what's out there. I want to go to one last example for you here. I know we have just a couple minutes left, but just in terms of the changing scope. And this one happens to involve, again, a large multi-intercity project at a inner city campus. If you go to the picture that we have of the athletic field and complex that we have here, what we have here is inner city community college project. In this context, of course, whatever any city community college needs is a top golf driving range, which is being put right in the middle of this particular project that we have here. Unfortunately, what happened was that, but my architect who was involved signed up because they wanted to do everything else around it. They wanted to do the athletic field, the academic buildings, the performing arts building. Ultimately, because the top golf facility was most important to the university chancellor, that was the only one that got built. They weren't in a prime, they had no experience with it, they'd never done something like that, and the program and the project changed completely in terms of what was taking place out there. As a result, all of the services were provided by the sub-consultants to the architect on the project, and as a result of that, they ended up paying disproportionately, but the architect also ended up picking up the bill because, as under theories of what we call respondeat superior, where the prime is responsible for the subs, they had to pick up everything that was out there. And so here would have been a great situation. Plan your project. My client didn't plan the project correctly because they didn't really understand how a community college project worked in California. They were a university architect. They thought it was just like designing something at Harvard, Cal, or Stanford. It wasn't, because it's built in California and managed just like a K-12 school district. And then when the change happened in the program, they didn't take the step back. They didn't look at it and rearrange things to make sure things that were realigned for the different project. In this situation, as I said, the prime and one of the subconsultants ended up with disproportionate responsibilities. So stand-up is kind of an important kind of final message here. If you're a team member on a design team, what should you be thinking about or worried about for the insurance of the other team members?
You have to protect yourself. You have to have proper policies and procedures in place to make sure that they're carrying insurance, that they're protected. Otherwise, you get left holding the bag. And it sounds like that's what happened here.
In my situation, my architect provided zero design, but ended up paying $2.6 million in liability because of those insurance issues and some inconsistent contracting practices. So kind of in summary, as we approach the top of the hour, our approach is evaluate the plan for your project and coordinate your contracts and do it consistent with that plan. Protect the plan by those contracts we've talked about. Monitor, evaluate, and act strategically during your project, either on the metric or the event-based system. Communicate and document the critical transitions and transactions. Just as I talked about, informed consent is such a critical element for you in protecting yourself, and then to continue to follow up vigilantly for what's out there. I invite any of you to post questions to the PUA team to the extent there are questions that come in after this that are worthy of a response. Well, they'll all be worthy of a response. We're open to providing some sort of group response on those, if that makes sense. Want to also refer you again to the university guidelines and the resources there because they're valuable. I hope this was valuable to you. Sandip, thank you so much for your input here, and I'll let you walk us out at this point in time at the top of the hour.
Yeah, thank you, David. Excellent presentation. I can't tell you how many the sort of the last few slides when we were going over the contract provisions or lack thereof in your recommendations. I can't tell you how many claims that we get that could have been avoided if the right policies and procedures were in place or the right documentation was in place. So appreciate everyone joining us. We know your time's valuable. Hope you found this presentation valuable. We will be sending a recording to everyone that registered for this, and there is your instructions to get a certificate. Brad B. Lynch at PUAinc.com. Please email them and we will send you a certificate of completion. And again, thank you. And as David said, if you have any questions, please feel to reach out to either one of us and we will get back to you. Thanks again, David. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sandips. Thanks to everybody for being here. We hope it was useful.